Like to call the work session order for October 17th, 2022. Will City Clerk please read the roll?
Let the record reflect that Councilmember Campbell is not present.
Thank you. We have 2 items on the agenda. I would like to remind council the staff will be pausing intermediately to answer any questions. First item is to discuss the capital improvement program and the Citizens Bond Exploratory Committee. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Finance Director. We are here today to give you an overview of how our capital improvement plan is funded and how it relates to GO bonds and our upcoming bond committee. Jared's going to be doing the vast majority of the presentation, so I will turn it over to him.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. So tonight, we're going to go through 4 main things. First, we're going to review our current funding sources for our capital improvement program, CIP. Then we're going to talk about some upcoming revisions to plans that we have, both on the revenue side and on the expenditure side. Then we'll touch on bonds. And then finally, we'll have a discussion on the Citizen Bond Exploratory Committee and get some feedback from council before we go into that committee so we can possibly have some bumpers in place when we get there. When we talk about the committee, we're going to look at the role of the committee. We're going to talk about the election details and also property tax rate impact. And then finally, a dollar amount threshold for a potential election. So let's start by talking about our current funding sources. And we have 8 financial policies in place that help guide our CIP funding. So the first 2 are very important. One is that we will have a plan. Each year we will develop a plan, and we do that along with the budget. The second is that the first 5 years will be from known sources, which means that they will be fully funded. So when we talk about a fully funded CIP, that is the plan that we develop each year with the budget. That includes the first 5 years that we have the revenue sources identified for. We include asset management reserves in our CIP, and the next few policies I'll talk about have to do with where the funding comes from. So first of all, we dedicate fund balances for one-time purposes. So over the last few years, we've had our revenues increasing quite a bit as we've seen growth in the city. We've been pretty conservative with our revenue forecasts, which led to us having each year additional fund balance. That fund balance is used for one-time purposes, such as the CIP program. Construction sales tax is another policy that we have. Over the last couple of years, we've collected approximately $36 million a year in construction sales tax. Our current policy states that we can use up to $6.1 million of construction sales tax for operating purposes. The other $30 million are dedicated to CIP funding. Growth activities will be funded through growth fees. You'll see in a slide here in a chart that I've got, we have quite a bit of our CIP is funded through growth fees, development impact fees. And then enterprise funds will be self-sufficient, so they will pay for their own infrastructure. The last policy we'll talk about in more detail later in this evening's presentation. We have a limitation on when we can issue additional general obligation bonds, and that's when our property tax rate is at or less than $1.74. So this chart here shows us our funding sources for the next 5 years, fiscal years 23 through 27, based on the adopted CIP from last spring. You can see that general governmental funds, mostly made up of the construction sales tax and the fund balances that we talked about, makes up about 30% of the total. Enterprise funds paying for their infrastructure, about 10%. Development impact fees, almost half of what we're looking at here. We have a lot of growth-related infrastructure in our CIP, and they're being funded with development impact fees. That includes both fund balance and potentially bonding in the future, but for the purposes of the CIP that we put together, we show that as development impact fees. We have specifically identified $90.4 million worth of bonds, and we'll break that down a little bit more in a few slides.
And one other thing that's included in those development impact fees is we've got a couple of development agreements where the developer actually has to upfront the money and then reimburse through development impact fees. So that would be included in that lump as well.
So we'll move on to talk about some of the revisions to plans that we have. And the first one is actually the development impact fee study that we do. We're actually required by state law to do this every 5 years. So we're about a year ahead of time in doing it on this time frame. Development impact fees can be used for growth purposes only, so only infrastructure that's related to new growth. and to maintain our current levels of service. We can't increase our levels of service through impact fees. Again, I mentioned it was restricted by state law on how often we have to update it. It also has restrictions on what we can pay for with development impact fees. So for instance, we have restrictions that we can only build a recreation center that's 3,000 square feet, parks that are 30 acres or less. And for public safety, we can build training facilities specific to individual stations or substations, but not citywide training facilities. And that will be important when we get to a couple slides from now. Finally, as Doug had mentioned, we also use these to reimburse developers for infrastructure they put in, and through a development agreement, we will reimburse them through development impact fees. A little bit more on the DIF study. So the update is underway right now. Not many changes in state statute are impacting it this time around. The biggest impact is going to be the construction cost increases that we have seen since the last update. So for instance, a fire station in our previous study was about $7.2 million. And right now in the budget, I believe we have a $16.2 million fire station. So just on that piece of infrastructure alone, you can see that we're going to be dealing with quite a few construction cost increases as we do this update. So the plan for now is to come back to council with a notice to change the impact fees in January. Before we come with that notice, we'll hit the stakeholders and let them know what's coming. But after the notice is when we will have work sessions with them and really go through the gears and the putting together of the development impact fee so they can see how that's being put together. Council won't take action on the actual fee changes until in the spring along with the budget process. Some of the other plans that we have underway right now, the Public Safety Training Facility Master Plan, I had mentioned development impact fees can't be used for training facilities other than one specific to station or substation. So in this case, this public safety training facility would obviously be outside of what we can do with development impact fees. That master plan will be coming to council in December for review. Parks and Recreation Master Plan is also underway now and will be coming to council in January. Police is working on a staffing plan, and we have a transportation master plan that will be kicking off and will be completed next December. However, we will have information put together this spring so that we can start working on our CIP plan and also work with our bond committee with what we're seeing in the transportation master plan. Finally, we have the integrated water master plan that we have a kickoff meeting tomorrow morning to start the integrated water master plan. So each of these plans will have impacts on the CIP in the form of revisions to scheduling of projects. Also, new projects may show up in the CIP. These projects will need to have funding sources identified for them. So let's talk a little bit specifically on bonds. So generally a bond is a way that we can build infrastructure today by borrowing money and then repaying that over time with interest. One of the things that you'll hear, kind of a concept you'll hear about bonds, is that it promotes generational equity. And what that means is that the infrastructure that we build with bonds usually has a useful life of somewhere between 20 and 50 years in length. And over that life of that infrastructure, the users that benefit from that infrastructure will change multiple times. A bond will spread the timing of those costs out to match when the users are benefiting from the infrastructure. So in that way, it promotes generational equity. So going back to the funding that we have in the 5-year plan, the $90.4 million, 1/3 of that is GO bonds that we have already issued, so paying for renovations to our fire stations, the expansion of the police headquarters, and for Camelback Road. We also have future water bonds and future wastewater bonds planned within that CIP, but as of right now, we haven't specifically picked a date when we would need to issue those bonds. The total outstanding bonds for the city is $389.3 million, split almost evenly between general obligation bonds and revenue at almost 40% each. Special assessment district that we have, $21.1 million, And finally, the Municipal Property Corporation debt of 54.5. We'll talk about each of those more specifically, starting with the special assessment bonds, $21 million. A special assessment bond is issued in a specific area, a district is created, and the infrastructure has to benefit that district. Additionally, the properties within the district are who pay for the bond debt service payments. An election is required. Usually this is done when there is one landowner of the district. At the beginning, when the developer comes forward looking to form a district. So the election is usually one person or one entity voting for that formation and for the bond authorization. The example that we have within the city is McDowell Road Commercial Corridor Improvement District. We also issue these with our Community Facilities District. That number is not included in the total that you see here because the community facility districts are separate entities from the city. However, we will be bringing a special assessment district formation in Estrella Mountain Ranch in the next couple of months before the district board. Municipal Property Corporation is, we talk about it more as a Public Improvement Corporation. The PIC debt that we have, most specifically used for the Goodyear Ballpark. This is a funding source that requires that we pledge our revenue collections, so local sales tax, primary property tax, state shared revenues. We pledge that to pay the debt for whatever is issued in our PIC that is not a new source of revenue, it's existing revenue. So we're essentially saying that we have $70 million worth of local revenues, and we will pledge those to pay for the debt service going forward. Because there isn't a specific revenue source tied to this, this usually has a little bit worse interest or higher interest rate than what you would see from general obligation bond, for instance. The special improvement districts, because of their size, usually they're smaller than what the city is, and they have a smaller tax base. They usually have a higher interest rate as well. Revenue bonds, a lot like what you saw with the PIC, we pledge our utility revenues to issue our revenue bonds, specifically the enterprise funds, water, wastewater, the surface water treatment plant's the biggest example that we've had over the last couple of years of revenue bonds that we have issued. Revenue bonds, as we issue them, don't necessarily need an election to issue those bonds. However, they are a subordinate lien, and what that means is they are second in line to other debt that we issued. So that's a signal to investors that this is a little bit riskier investment for them than a primary lien like a general obligation bond would be. For that purpose, the revenue bonds usually have a higher interest rate as well. Finally, we have general obligation bonds. They are backed by a secondary property tax, which is different than a pledge in that by state statute, the secondary property tax will be set at whatever amount is necessary to pay for the debt service of a general obligation bond. So, and that's based off of the valuation of each of the properties within our city. Usually the lowest interest rate because of the guarantee of that taxing, the secondary property tax that would generate whatever revenue is necessary to pay for the debt service. So today, the $150.6 million of outstanding that we have, 75% of that, while all of it is backed by secondary property tax, 75% of it is what we actually use the secondary property tax to pay. We have an additional 25% of water and wastewater that the utility fees pay for that debt service each year. However, they enjoy a lower interest rate because we issue general obligation bonds for that infrastructure. So our current bond ratings line out somewhat with what I talked about with the risks of each of those different bonds. So you can see our general obligation bonds are AA1 rated by Moody's and AA plus by Standard & Poor's. That's one rating below a AAA rating in both instances, really because of that guarantee from the secondary property tax that you receive from a general obligation bond. Municipal Property Corporation, somewhat surprisingly, is just below our general obligation bond. It has the same rating in Standard & Poor's, but it's one rating less in the Municipal Property Corporation. However, we have seen vast increases in our revenues since the last time we issued bonds back in 2012 using the PIC. So that has really impressed the rating agencies. So we have seen increases in those ratings for our PIC debt that we have. Our revenue bonds are one step below those two, and that really comes from that secondary lien concept that I talked about, how they are second in line to other debt sources. If anything were to happen, they would get paid second after other debt sources get paid. And finally, the special assessment district, because of its size, is the lowest. You can see that in Moody's, we kind of have a little flip-flop between revenue and special assessment district there, how it's one grade lower for the revenue in Moody's, and then it's one grade higher in Standard & Poor's. But generally, higher interest rates than you would see with the general obligation bond for those. For the general obligation bond, though, we have three restrictions. One is a debt capacity limit. The second is our property tax rate guideline that we have in our financial policies. And finally, we have voter authorization. So the debt capacity is set by the state constitution. It's based off a percentage of the valuation of the city, less any outstanding general obligation debt that we have. So there's two different categories of the percentages. There's a 20% and there's a 6%. So there are some types of infrastructure you can use the 20% for, and then the 6% there's others. But for our conversation, we're going to combine that debt capacity into a single 26% number. So currently, our debt capacity stands at $261.9 million, and we can take a look at that over the last 20 years. So you can see that as we issue debt, we have less capacity back in 2002 to 2003. And then as we had growth in our valuation, it started to come up. You see the sawtoothing kind of down here as we issued debt and growth came, and we issued debt and growth came, and we issued debt. And then we saw very rapid increases in our valuation back in the mid-2000s. Usually the capacity, just like the valuations that we see from the county, lag a couple of years behind the actual on-the-ground prices. So same thing happens with that capacity because they use that valuation as part of the calculation. So in 2009, we peaked, and then valuations dropped within the city and really statewide, nationwide, which impacted our debt capacity. And through this time, we actually were not issuing debt, and you'll see that on a couple slides from now. And then we started seeing increases in that valuation, and our capacity started to rise. We issued debt in 2016. You can see 2019. You can see 21 as we issued debt. But we're seeing that climb as our valuation climbs right now to $262 million. Next year, we'll have less outstanding debt as we're paying debt down. We're not issuing additional debt this year from general obligation bonds. Our valuation is expected to increase as well. So our debt capacity should increase even more than what we're seeing today. So by the time we get to the bond committee by February, mid-February, we should know about where we're going to be with our debt capacity, but it'll be higher than what we have currently. Next, we'll talk about our property tax rate guideline we had in the policies. So our combined rate has to be at $1.74 or lower in order for us to issue new GO bond debt. Now, that's issuing GO bond debt. That's not voter authorization. That's not debt capacity. It's just a restriction that we can't issue unless the rate is less than $1.74. And this forecast is what we used when we were putting together the budget and the CIP for this year. You can see for the current year, we're at $1.73.5. We're expecting to stay at that rate for the next 2 fiscal years, at which time the rate will drop down to $1.44, and it'll continue to decrease as our valuations increase. Based on this gap that we're seeing here, we can support new debt of approximately $110 million if we say there's no new growth after this 5th year. But if we say, hey, we're going to continue to have growth over the next 20 years, and our estimate starts at about 4%, and then it tapers down to about 2%. If we say we're going to continue to have growth over the next 20 years, the life of a potential bond, we should be able to support about $175 million. Finally, we have voter authorization.
Can you go back to that graph real quick and walk me through again how you get to those numbers?
So these rates, these are the rates that, this is the current property tax rate that we have.
Okay.
And the way that we have our debt service planned over the next few years, we're expecting that the rate is going to have to continue to be $1.73.5 for the next 2 years.
Okay.
Then our debt service payments are going to decrease. So the needed secondary or the needed property tax rate will only need to be $1.44 at that point to cover the current debt service that we have.
Okay, so that's just purely, those are hard numbers, that our debt service is going to go down starting in 2025.
Correct.
Giving us that leeway, okay.
The one thing that will change is based on the valuations that we have. If valuations increase faster
Right.
than what our projections are. So in the first 5 years, we're using we're using 6.5% for the first 3 years and then 4% going forward. So we've seen double-digit increases in our valuations for the last 5 years. So if we see a double-digit valuation increase again next year, that's going to change these numbers. But generally speaking, we have flat debt service expected for the next few years, and then it will drop in 2026.
Okay, thank you.
Good question for you. That's primary and secondary, correct?
That's correct. That's the total property tax rate.
And the reason why it's going down is primary, we can only increase at 2% per year, plus new assessed valuations as it grows. So, and the debt piece on that added to that is why it's dropping, because you don't need as much of that secondary. So both are in there, primary and secondary, and that's why it's kind of going down. We usually tend to maximize the primary, so we'll have more of that going up, but the secondary would start to go down as what he's mentioned is required. Just make sure you know there's both of it in there, primary and secondary, okay.
Okay, let's talk about voter authorization. So voter authorization is required for general obligation bonds. We are not limited in the amount of voter authorization that we could have at any one time, and voter authorization does not expire. So here's the history of our voter authorization, starting in 1988 when we had our first election, $15.5 million. We had an additional $50 million in 1994. $138 million was added of voter authorization in 2000. And then in 2004, we had $134 million of additional authorization. So in 2004, after that election, we peaked at voter authorization at $284 million. And then you can see as we issued bonds, that voter authorization is declining. And then you can kind of see the impact of our property tax rate guideline. As on our previous slide, you saw the valuations dropping. Well, through this period here, we couldn't issue any debt because we exceeded that guideline. I have a slide in a couple of slides from now that overlays the two of these so you can kind of see that relationship. But we weren't able to issue any debt through this portion because we were exceeding our property tax rate guideline, and then began issuing debt again in 2017. Brings us to today, we have $44.4 million of outstanding voter authorization, specifically in the sewer and the storm sewer bridges and drainage areas. So all the public safety, fire protection, all of the streets, all of the public buildings, all of the parks and recreation has been used up over the last 6 years. So now let's talk about our Citizen Bond Exploratory Committee. So let's talk about the role of the committee, some of the election details that we'll be presenting to them, the property tax rate impacts that they need to be bringing back to the council. And also, we'll talk a little bit about a dollar amount threshold maybe that we want to give to them before they even begin. So the role of the committee, one of the big things is that they have to recommend a financing plan to council. That's the major item that they will be bringing back to you. So they need to identify the projects, the priorities. Most important is the timing of those projects. What project goes first, what project goes next. The property tax impact of whatever they're recommending to council. And finally, they have to have input on the ballot questions as well. So let's talk about those election details first. So the committee is going to be looking at having a single election. That's really what they're looking at. And they will be dividing the projects into short-term projects and long-term projects. Short-term is 2 to 5 years, and the long-term is 5 to 10 years. Essentially, the short-term projects are the ones that they will be recommending for election for next year. The long-term projects would be ones that would be in a future election. They won't be considering the timing of a future election. They will specifically be looking at an election for next fall and what will be in for the election next fall. I'll kind of leave that open to council to maybe discuss that a little bit if you have anything you'd like to ask about that.
Any questions at this point? Bill?
So you said it would be a single election, but then we'd have, which means, what do you mean by that?
So what we'd be looking at is a single election next fall for getting voter authorization. Within that election, though, we're looking at having separate questions for categories. And I have some examples of the categories there: public safety, transportation, parks and recreation, those categories that we've extinguished over the last few years. But we're having them focus on just a single election, which would be the election in 2023. We're not going to have them say, hey, and then take this next category of projects and go out again in 2025.
Oh, that's what you mean by
It's
single
in
election.
2023, or it's for a future election. That's
So-
the focus.
Yeah, you're going to do them all in one shot, is basically what you're talking about, and you're talking about multiple categories, or multiple questions, as opposed to, library, parks, public safety, transportation, all or nothing.
Correct. That is correct.
They're all going to be broken, so they can say no to library and yes to transportation, or vice versa. Okay, just making sure I understood that. I thought I did before I came in, and then when you talked about it, got a little confused.
That's our job.
Anybody else? Everybody okay? Go ahead.
I got to follow up to that. So you said the questions that we bundled in that election, you said you have longer-term ones that'll be for a future election down the line.
That's
So-
correct. That's correct.
We don't know what those are going to be, but those are bigger, longer-term projects. Okay.
Correct. They may actually not be bigger projects, but from a priority
Or just-
perspective,
Yeah.
the committee might say, hey, this is a project that can wait 7 years.
Yeah.
And if it falls into that long-term category, then that's not something we'd consider for this election.
Yeah, but we'll have the committee's input that we can continue to use in future years.
That's correct.
Right. Thank you.
Laura?
You said 2023, so this will be a standalone election?
That is correct.
Okay. Mail-in ballot kind of thing like, okay,
Let's hope so.
yeah, very good. Thank you.
Anybody else? Go ahead.
Next, property tax rate impact. One of the key things is that we're going to take to the committee the current guideline as it sits as $1.74. We're not going to have the committee have a discussion over whether that should be changed. That's council direction that it's going to be $1.74. And within that, we will present the impacts in line with the state statute. So state statute says that when we do a publicity pamphlet for a potential general obligation bond election, we have to show the impacts on an owner-occupied residence of $250,000, commercial of $1 million, and agriculture or vacant at $100,000. Obviously, the commercial and agriculture lets you scale those up because they're even numbers. The owner-occupied residence was a number that was selected at the time that they came up with the statute. So in addition to those, we'll also be looking at medians in each of those categories to present both what's required by state statute and also the medians in those categories, so we can kind of have a balance there. Any other impacts you would like to see brought back by the committee as far as the property tax rate or the property tax impact on properties themselves?
Anything? Go ahead.
We always, am I on? Yeah. I think when we do this, we always have, anytime we deal with the property taxes, it always gets a little confusing what our portion is, what everyone else's portion. So I just ask that when you do bring out those numbers, you kind of keep it very straightforward so it doesn't get confusing. Because I think when you're talking about primary, secondary, and all these other tax rates, people just lump us all and think their bill's going to go extremely high, and just, I guess, keep it simple.
Go ahead.
So you said the medians for each as well, that category, so you're gonna take what the median is for any house, all houses in Goodyear?
Correct. We'd be looking at the median, each of those categories that
Okay,
you see
that's what I
there.
mean, yeah, yeah, because to your point, 250 is not necessarily the average house anymore, so, okay, thank you.
Everybody okay? Go ahead.
So dollar amount threshold. As I had mentioned before, voter authorization is not limited in amount. And you saw that at one point back in 2004, we had $285 million worth of voter authorization. The largest election for voter authorization we've had was in 2000, $138 million. This is the slide I promised from before, kind of overlaying our debt capacity and voter authorization, so you can see there's no relationship between voter authorization and debt capacity. The debt capacity does not restrict what our voter authorization is, so there's no tie between those two. You can see that through most of this 20-year period, we actually had more voter authorization than debt capacity. It wasn't until about 2018 that situation changed.
But the constitutional limits will prevent that. So you're right, voter authorization, you can have whatever you want, but because of the constitutional 20%, 6%, there's a cap there, so.
So we end up with two caps, because one will be the debt capacity
Right.
from the Constitution. The second is going to be what we can actually support. When we go to issue debt, we can't issue more debt than we
We
can
can't
support
support,
with
yeah.
our $1.74 rate.
Correct.
So those are really the two factors that are going to end up limiting what we can issue. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we could have more voter authorization that we could afford, or that the debt capacity in the Constitution allows.
No, I agree. I just wanted to clarify that. Yeah, that's all.
So over the last 5 years, we had new voter authorization within Maricopa County. You're looking at here. Each of these, with the exception of Gilbert and Mesa, was a single election. So for Gilbert, they had one election that was $65 million, and they had a second election a year ago that was $515 million. For Mesa, they had one election that was $196 million, and a second one a couple of years later that was $100 million. Different categories in their case. But you can see that we've had varying amounts of voter authorization that was asked for and received over the last 5 years. For the city of Surprise at $60 million, one of the differences between them and some of the other cities you see here is they did not have a secondary property tax before. They didn't have any outstanding general obligation bonds, so they were essentially going to their voters and saying, would you like to have a tax increase to have these projects built? So theirs was a little bit smaller, so they could get their toe in the water a little bit, get people sort of used to how secondary property tax and general obligation debt works. So that's why you see them kind of at the far right of this chart. But I guess the question from staff to council is, do you want to give direction to the committee on an authorization amount that would be the maximum that you would like to see come back from them, knowing that the $1.74 guideline will be discussed with them. They will have to show those impacts. That will create a restriction on how much could be brought back to council. But wanted to see if council had any input on that topic.
Yeah.
Well, I think the think the $1.74 becomes your automatic, that's your limiter. So if $1.74 allows you $138 million, which I think was the number, then that's your limit. So I don't think we want to, or 110, 175. So I don't think we want to say to the committee, shoot over those, give us $1.86 or give us $1. I don't think we want to do that. We fought long and hard to get to the $1.74 number. We were as high as $1.96 at one point. So I don't think we want them to do that. But I also, in the same regard, don't want to limit the citizens' involvement in saying, these are the things that we need. And if they're saying to us, yeah, there's needs in parks and fire and PD and library, but we want all of it to go to transportation, then I think we need to hear that. I personally don't want to hear a peanut buttered approach where everybody gets a little something. I want to know what they have, what they think fits within that model, without exceeding the $1.74. I can just bring that back to, that's my thought.
Anybody else? Go ahead.
So is this the math here? Is this the most we're going to get out of it?
So this
The
is,
110 and the 175?
this is the math as of today, but we know that we're going to have new valuation numbers in the spring and February. So by the time we go to the committee and talk about the impacts, it will likely be higher than $175 million if we use that 20-year forecast, which is, when we put a publicity pamphlet together, state statute has guidelines on how we have to set that up
Yeah.
and the forecast that we can use. But using that forecast methodology, we would be in this same area. But valuations will change, so it'll go up a little bit by the time we get to the committee. But these are general guideline of where we're at today.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be curious, the committee, I guess, without looking at this, what is the need? And then what dollar amount do we need to satisfy those needs for the next 20 years? I know this is obviously the limiter, but maybe there's room to figure out another way to still satisfy the need the community might want and still maybe hit this. So I'm not sure. I'm sure what that solution is. So, and then I'd be curious, looking at I'm sure you guys are going to look at this already with our bond committee, like what Gilbert got for the 580, what's palatable to the voters for each of those cities, what kind of things that they were trying to go for, how they formatted their votes and things like that, which I'm sure are all topics that the committee will research. But yeah, I just want to make sure that they are able to provide as much input as possible, and then I guess we can maybe come back and look at how to get there. So, because it could be maybe there's a better idea out there. So, thank you.
Sherry?
Thank you. I agree that we don't want to go past the 174. I think that's kind of where we want to set it at. But I guess I'm a little confused on how this works. What number would we be asking the voters for the 20-year 175, give or take whatever the property is? Or do we put a buffer in there knowing property values will increase? And then ask for whatever 180, knowing that it's going to, I mean, how do you, what number do you give the public out of those two?
That's exactly the question. That's the question we're trying to answer right now. From a financial perspective, you would say $175 million, but that's based on very conservative growth estimates. And we know historically, we had as much as $284 million of voter authorization. So to a certain extent is what do we think that the voters will accept? What do they see as a acceptable number? And that's part of what the committee should help us with, is to tell us that. Is the $515 million that Gilbert issued a year ago and received voter authorization for, is that palatable for the Goodyear voters? The committee probably needs to give us a little bit of input on that.
And if we, oh, sorry, and my second part is maybe that help out. If we ask for more than the 175, we don't have to issue all of those. Those can kind of be held back if property taxes or if property values were to go higher than expected, so we wouldn't, because I don't want to blow through that 175. I think that's important. But we could ask for more kind of as a safeguard that if property taxes or property values go up. I'm sorry, Doug, I didn't mean to
No,
interrupt you.
you're absolutely correct. And that's one of the pieces where it's not only the 175 sets an expectation. We don't want we don't want the bond committee, the citizens council, anybody to think if we get voter authorization for $400 million or whatever that number that's palatable to the public, whatever the committee thinks, whatever council thinks, we want to make sure that that's tempered with the fact that within the $1.74, here's what we realistically can do. However, if things change, if the valuation goes up, then we could have some more. So it's really balancing the two, what's palatable with balancing expectations.
Okay, yeah, I think I'd like to make sure, like you said, the 174, but have that wiggle room if we get a lot of commercial or get a lot of industrial or housing goes up, that we do have that cushion so we can have the money for growth without exceeding it, but knowing that we may not need all that. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Laura.
Well, thank you for continuing to go over this, because it is kind of a process to understand how that works. And so with this example, with 175, where we said, well, that's the number, we could be short selling ourselves because the valuation could go up. And so that's a dilemma. And we all know that real estate is cyclical, and you know, it could go down before it goes back up. But with a long-term viewpoint, or how we've done it for such a long term, I guess you just weather it out as long as you don't exceed the $1.74, right? And so so you're picking a number and you may not get to it. So, okay, I'm just, again, processing out loud. And does this, picking a number, factor in, you know, possible recession, inflation, all the economic pressures that we're facing? Or are we just looking for a trajectory up?
So there isn't specifically recession factored into this to say that, you know, we don't have a year where we're saying that valuations are going to drop.
Yeah.
But we have been conservative in that we're saying 6.5% growth for the next few years. We've been seeing double digits up near 12%. Then it's going to drop down to 4% and eventually down to 2%. So while we're showing growth in each year, it's conservative growth. So it's almost like it's trying to smooth out that cyclical nature somewhat in what we're doing.
I think our conservative fiscal policies have served us very well in that respect. So, thank you.
Go ahead, Brandon.
I just had a follow-up too. So if the committee comes back and says, we're approved 300 million, for example, not that I necessarily want to do this, but if councils in the future, if they wanted to raise the threshold like 1.8, they could they still do that? Is that something if they wanted to get the money sooner to go do bigger projects with more of a chunk of that money as opposed to waiting for valuations to get higher? Because it's administrative for us. But I'm just curious, if you put a bond out saying, we're going to do this, could councils change how they do it administratively and then do more of a chunk of that earlier?
Just like you mentioned, it's administrative in nature, that guideline. So each year when we adopt the policies, council could revise that policy. So it could change every year. It could change.
Okay. And not saying it's going to, I'm just curious, when you put the bond out, what you're telling voters, and if we're locked into something or not, so. Okay, I'm just curious. Thank you.
Bill.
We're giving you a complete non-answer tonight. I realize that, and I'm probably the biggest instigator of that. But, you know, this is reminiscent of and I'm hesitant to say the words, but the Prop 400 original thing that went out in 2004, where we thought we'd get this whole laundry list of things through Prop 400, and here we sit today, and we've gone through rebalancing, and we're getting what appears to be half of what we thought we were getting. And I'm afraid that with the bond committee shooting too far to kind of Doug's point, we are going to be setting false expectations that, well, you said we'd have light rail running through the city, and now we're not, here we are 15 years later, and we don't even have a bus yet. So I think we really have to be very, very careful, regardless of what the numbers are, of how much we're shooting for. We haven't had, Surprise is the closest community to us to have done a bond election in quite some time. I hear Wally in my mind saying, "Why are we always the first ones?" And here we are, we're the first ones again, kind of testing the water. So I don't really think we know what the palette is. If you look at the school bond elections, and I think that will be very informative for us, post-November, while they're completely different, if the mentality of the voter is, I want no more taxable money coming out of my pocket, then I think we're going to be in I think that's going to inform this conversation completely different than us sitting here today saying, we've got great citizens and they believe in what we're doing, and, they're 96% behind us. That's great. So again, still not answering the question, but I think all of those things are going to factor into where you guys head with this committee in the spring. And maybe that number looks between that 175 and 300. I mean, I cannot in my wildest imagination picture this community just blindly opening their checkbook for a $300 million bond. I just can't see it. Even if we say, look, your tax rate is never going to change, I think $300 million is going to be a shocking number. If you look on, look west side, it's going to be crazy. And everyone's going to be looking at us going, all right, look what Goodyear just did, so let's pare back. So I think you guys are going to have to feel your way through it until you get to hear from that giant citizen group.
Hey, go ahead.
I was just going to say one thing, this chart here that shows what some of the other cities, mostly, as you said, East Valley cities have done in the past, really is going to be a guideline for us. We also did hear that the city of Phoenix is going out for a bond issue in November at the same time, and they're going for $500 million bond authorization. So that kind of puts things into perspective with us as well. And Jared, I believe you've got the information on the rate of passage on some of these, the success rate, not the success rate, but the voters saying yes.
Yeah, so on some of these, like Tempe, Scottsdale, and Chandler, you were seeing in the 60s and low 70s for a pass rate. For Gilbert, we'll talk specifically about their $515 million transportation-only question that they sent out. It passed 50.2%, so it was a very narrow margin. When you have a narrow margin then too, you have essentially half of your city who didn't support this tax, and you're going to be really held to the fire to deliver $515 million worth of transportation infrastructure. So that's going to have to kind of factor into this as well.
Yeah, I think as far as the school bonds, I'm not sure I would tie my hat on that, only because I think they've got bigger issues they're going for than what we're going for. I think the bottom line is when you have the bond committee, you're going to try to explain the projects that we want to get done. And typically, some of these cities don't do that. We involve citizens who come up with recommendations, which I think increases our success rate, number one, if the citizens are out there pushing the success of the projects of what we want. But I tend to agree that from a dollar and cent standpoint, that fine balance in there is going to be one of those things you're going to have to work your way through. What is palatable? You know what I mean? What are they willing to take? And you don't want to get it too much out there because they may like the projects, but those numbers are too large. They may say, nah, they might scare them away. But I think the important thing is to get that feedback from the bond committee, because in the past, we've always had good success because we've had the citizens come up and agree to the plan, and then help go out and push the plan, which makes it kind of nice, as opposed to, I'm not mistaken, Scottsdale tried to do that once without the citizen committee and didn't go very well, okay? Where we use the citizen committee and it does go well, you know what I mean? So we got to have input from them and get a feel for where they want to go. So I know you probably didn't get the straightest answer from all of us on there, but I think it's important. We've got nothing in there for roads, for public safety or buildings, zero. We got zapped. The only thing you got left is sewer and what is it, the
Storm
storm
sewer
drain. So, I mean,
drainage.
you've got nothing. So you can't do any projects with bonds going forward for anything. So you've got to figure out some way to get some of that authorization in there if you want to keep moving the city forward with this growth that's going on. I mean, because there is massive growth coming here. But that number, we got to be careful. You don't want it too large, you know. And again, you can always do it again if you don't have enough, you know what I mean, as opposed to scaring them away. So I would just caution, be careful on how high that number happens to be.
Last item rolls right out of what you just said, Mayor. One of the roles of the committee is to seek out and promote public involvement. So the committee will end May 31st, and public outreach will begin after council action, which will be with the budget. So at that point, the city and staff can only educate and can't advocate for the bonds, for any of the questions, any of the projects. The role of the committee will change. They won't any longer be a committee. They'll be the private citizen that you had talked about, Mayor, that will then need to hopefully go out with the education we give them and talk to people intelligently about the bond questions that we have out there. So one of the things we just wanted to point out is, I know we'll be selecting a committee here soon. One of the key things we want to make sure is that they are aware that they need to seek out and promote public involvement. They're going to be talking to people possibly in front of larger groups. So hopefully we'll get some people that are comfortable doing that, because that is one of the roles of the committee.
That's good. Go ahead.
I think also, and I wasn't sure, a couple years ago, I think Peoria had several bonds that did not pass, if I'm right. It was several years ago.
That may have been outside of the window I was
Okay.
looking at here, because I just went back to 2017.
Because I think they
went
kind
the last
of
5.
lumped them together and it was all fell down. And then, what was my other question? I totally forgot. Senior moment.
Well, I'll draw it out a little bit. So I'll mention on surprise.
coming back.
on-
Let's left the
on-
building.
On surprise, I know that the previous year, they had a bond election that went out, single question, with multiple categories in the single question. It was $64 million, and it failed. And then the following year, they had separate questions, and it passed. They had transportation and public safety. Did I draw it out just long enough for you?
You did, I
All right.
remember. So now with the Maricopa County Transportation Tax in grave jeopardy of being renewed, is that something we take in consideration with our projects? Like what could have gone there? I mean, how does that figure in when you're looking at the projects?
So one of the things that we're going to bring to the committee is the results that we have at that point of the master plan, the transportation master plan. But certainly that's something that we're going to talk about is, what are the highest priority projects and what's the funding source going to be? And if we say it's a high priority project, the one thing that we will do with the questions is we won't be specific down to the individual projects when we say transportation. That way, that gives us some leeway if something changes, traffic patterns change, or if funding sources come from other areas, then we can shift that funding to something else within transportation. But it should be something within the transportation master plan that we presented to the committee that they said, yes, this is infrastructure that we'd like.
Laura?
Historically, how has the committee been selected?
Historically here, we haven't had an election since 2004.
Does anybody know?
If anybody would know, he'd be sitting across from us.
Tell you the truth, no. I was here in 2004, but my memory doesn't go that far back. Yeah,
Because,
yeah.
yeah, interesting, because there's quite a significant expectations of these committee members, not only to have the sophistication to understand this, and I've heard it for a couple of years. I mean, it takes a while to process, but then to have them be out advocating, so. Yeah, I guess we'll have to think about that as well.
And as of right now, we have, the committee will be made up of
13.
13 members, 11 members, 2 alternates, and we have 13 people who have applied for the committee at this point. It is still open, correct, Darcy? Yes. Yeah, it is still open, so if we know people that would be great, that would be great to reach out to them.
Go ahead.
That's all I've got. I'd like to say that actually the conversation we had gave us plenty of information that we need to go forward with the committee. You guys were hitting on all of the topics that we hit on when we're in the office. So it's a great conversation, and we do have plenty of information to help guide us as we go forward with the committee. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I was kind of expecting how the Pharaohs did their capital improvement plans back in the day, but, you know, that's, you know. But thank you for the presentation.
I was told I could only go back to 1988 is
Okay.
as far as I could go, so.
But he can tell us when the first GO bond was issued.
Yeah, there
if
you
you are
go.
interested.
It was 1812.
Thank you. The next item is a discussion on the results of the 2022 Employee Engagement Satisfaction Survey. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Lyman Lockett, Human Resources Director. Tonight, I'm here to provide a presentation on the summary of our most recent employee survey. We again contracted with Polco. Polco and National Research Center merged back in 2019. And they specialize in this space of local government and the public sector. We've used Polco since 2014. Every 2 years, we do a citywide employee survey. The survey that we use is the National Employee Survey, and their instrument looks at a number of things. These are some of the things that they look at and some of the things that we rely on the survey for. We look at our organizational strengths and challenges, employee trends, employee needs, benchmark ourselves against our benchmark cities that are in the survey, and then we're looking to improve our employee experience and continue to move towards best place status. These are the areas that the National Employee Survey looks at, and I'll highlight a couple of them. New to the survey this round is equity and inclusion. The prior survey didn't have equity and inclusion questions, so that's an enhancement to this survey. Workplace Essentials is a new segmentation that they look at. But generally, you're going to see some of the same components. This instrument was slightly adjusted. There used to be 133 questions. It's down to 99 questions, a much cleaner survey. Most of the employees that took the survey commented on the ease of use of the survey, as well as understanding of the survey data. So we feel very comfortable about what we got out of the survey. Again, you'll see benchmark comparisons in the survey. The National Employee Survey has a database of 300,000 employee voices, so we feel very good about benchmarking through the survey. But one of the things we recognize since we've been doing the survey since 2014 is the best benchmark is our own organization, and our survey data has kind of taken us to the point where we're really looking at ourselves as the key benchmark. Our survey was conducted in the month of August. Excuse me. We mailed the survey out to 724 employees, and 651 employees took the survey for a 90% response rate. So we feel very good about that response rate, a high level of confidence that this is reflective of our overall organization. I'd add that the average for the National Employee Survey is 60%. So again, we feel very comfortable. Our goal is always 100%. We work hard to get 100%. We feel good about 90%, but as we continue down this venture, we're always pushing for 100%. One of the factors we look at is employee engagement. And one of our key indicators, this is also a council goal, so how many of our employees are satisfied with their job. So 95% of our employees are satisfied overall with their job. This is a council goal, and also I'll speak to this in greater detail as it relates to the council goal. But the point that I would look at here is that trend line going back to 2016. You will see data further in the survey that goes all the way back to 2014. But here we do have a positive trend line from year to year, ending at 95% of our employees either strongly agree or somewhat agree that they're overall satisfied with their job. Here we look at 9 and 10 employees are, again, engaged in their job. And these are engagement factors that the survey looks at. Point out a couple of them here. 9 in 10 of our employees plan to work for the city in a year. And that's key data. We've all heard about the Great Resignation. A lot of data out there doing surveys on employees, and much of the data I see is in the 50 to 60 percentile of employees are looking for work. They plan on looking for another job from their current employer. So we feel very good that 9 in 10 of our employees plan to be here a year from now. Here's our Net Promoter Score. So 96% of our employees would likely recommend working for the city of Goodyear. We also balance this with our exit interview survey, so it's consistent. Our exit interview surveys, employees leaving the city are actually a little bit higher than those staying. So again, we feel good about this as a Net Promoter Score. And again, at the bottom there, you can see a positive trend line. We moved from 88% of our employees up to 96%. You'll also see that indicator throughout the survey where we're higher than the benchmark. These are key drivers of employee engagement specific to us here in the city of Goodyear. Those things that are starred are correlated. These are closely correlated with things that drive engagement in our city. So demonstrating respect for employees and different cultures and beliefs, providing clear vision for our organization, overall confidence of Goodyear government, and opportunities to develop a career path. Again, all things that drive employee engagement in our organization. Overview of survey results. I've highlighted a couple of things here. We've done a lot of work on values. So these are all scores that are above 95%. So values, we started our core value journey back in 2018. We think that we're seeing some of that effect in this survey. Again, that employees planning on working for the city, and then the likelihood to recommend the city as a place of employment. On the other end of the spectrum, we have scores here that are below 75. And there's a number of things here, compensation. One of the things I would add, although these are all below 90 or below 75%, they're all higher than the benchmark. So we know we have work to do here. Again, we're our own benchmark, so we're continuing to push. Compensation being at one of the areas that's below 75. We know we have some work groups that are off cycle from our normal salary increase program, so we think that's reflective here. And there's some other data here that you'll see a little bit later here that I think we can also point to that we've made some headway on. Again, there's 99 questions in the survey. Of the 99 questions in the survey, 98% were higher than the benchmark average. One question was similar, and we had 0 that were lower than the benchmark average as we compare ourselves to the benchmarks. These are areas of the survey that scored higher than the benchmark. So engagement, we have some opportunity. We have one question in the engagement area that came in below or similar to the benchmark average. Looking at our comparison to the 2020 survey, we had, of the 99 questions that are comparable, 13 were more positive, actually statistically significantly higher. 86 were similar to the ratings of last year, and we had 0 that were lower than the ratings from 2020. These are areas where we made significant headway in our survey. I'll talk about a couple of these in greater detail as well, but movement, 25 to 13% is certainly significant movement in the survey. So we feel good about this particular iteration of the survey. Looking at, this is a new benchmark measurement in the survey. The survey looks at where we ranked on each of the scores. So there's 99 questions in the survey. 86 of those survey questions are related to workplace, our workplace climate. There's 13 that are related to service. So of those 86 questions, on 48 of those questions, we ranked first. On 24 of those questions, we ranked second of the benchmark cities. So that's about 83% of the questions, a little over 83% of the questions, we ranked either first or second. Specific areas to Goodyear focus, and we'll see some opportunities here. So this is strategic plan goal number 1.5.1. Overall, I'm satisfied with my job. And as you can see here, 2022, our goal is to be 66% of our employees to rank this question as strongly agree. If we go back to 2014, 48% of our employees rated this area as strongly agree. And we've moved in the right direction. From 2020 to 2022, we moved from 60 to 61. Again, our goal is 66 by 2024. So we still have work to do here to move that. The good news is when we look back in history, back in 2014, 2016, 1 in 10 of our employees were not satisfied with their job. We've reduced that to 4%, and we're getting the migration that we want into this strongly agree. So headed in the right direction, but we still have work to do to get there. We also identified, this goes back to 2014, we identified 4 areas of the survey that we focused on: communicating information in a timely manner, opportunities to develop a career path, providing recognition for doing good work, and managing low-performing employees. We set a goal of 75% for each of these. So here's our performance here. So communicating information in a timely manner, we moved that from 63% up to 87%, going back to 2014. I think what's significant here, we did reach our goal of 75 last cycle in 2020, but we continued to perform and move that to 87. Opportunities to develop a career path. Back in 2020, we hadn't hit our goal of 75%. However, in our 22 survey, we moved it beyond the 75%, so we reached that goal. Again, we think a lot of these are related to some of the work we've been doing on our intentional design of Goodyear's culture. So our development of career pathing, communication of information in a timely manner, working with the communications department with our notes to know. So there's a lot of tools and things that we put in place to drive some of these scores. And then the other 2, providing recognition for doing good work. Again, we've moved it in a positive direction every year. In 2020, we hadn't hit our goal. We fell short at 73%. However, in 2022, we moved that beyond the goal. And then the most elusive one that we've worked on is managing low-performing employees. We started out with only 33% of our employees feeling like we dealt with low-performing employees. And we moved it. We got to 48%. We were well below the 75% goal. We introduced a new performance management system in last year. And we think that that's had some impact on moving this up to 73. Still not at the 75, but very close to reaching that goal of 75%. Key findings from Polco related to this survey. Employee development is valued by Goodyear employees and exceeds the national average in many areas. Here you can see some of the high marks there as it relates to employee development. Won't go through all of these, but again, some of these are points of focus for us, that opportunity to develop a career path. One of the things that we've looked at and tried to correlate back in 2014 when we picked those 4 areas is what are the 4 things that we think will drive results? So we feel like the areas that we picked are certainly driving results here. And here's some more data. Again, won't spend a lot of time here, but I think what to me is important is looking at the trend line, and that trend line from 2020 to 22 is there's a significant bump there that you'll see. Key finding number 2, employees appreciate the climate that the organization has fostered. Here you'll see some new data. So the questions without trend data are new questions to the survey. Again, I think we see an opportunity there, although we're higher than the benchmark average. Collaboration between departments is certainly an area that catches our eye, and there are a few others. And then this is an area that has been significantly statistically higher than our benchmarks over the years, and that's our supervisor-employee relationships, and we know that this drives much of what we do in the survey. Again, I think these factors look well. And here's a few more related to work group performance. And the last key finding, Goodyear employees give high marks to the work of the city and its leadership. And here's some factors. So this is one of the key indicators there of confidence in leadership. We looked at both supervisor and senior staff leadership, and employees feel good about both categories of leadership. This is also an area of the survey that was a cleanup because it was a little bit undistinguishable as to who we were talking about when we talked about a leader or we talked about executive leadership, so this is much cleaner. So we feel better about how we can use this information and where we see opportunities. And these are some other points, factors related to our overall city performance and performance of leadership. Again, you'll see the positive trend line, so we are continuing to improve, and all are higher than benchmark here as well. So those are the conclusions that they had, employee development being valued, appreciating the climate, and high marks for overall leadership. Our next steps, we're presenting the data today. We have a leadership summit coming up on October the 26th, where we'll be taking the survey out and doing a deep dive, looking at where our opportunities are at and planning for the future. We think our call to action is that council goal. How do we move our survey? How do we reach that 10% improvement from 61 to 66%? That'll be a key element of what we're working on. We'll be taking the information out to the employee groups November the 1st through the 3rd. And then another element of moving the dial is introducing Gallup Q12 survey. This will, again, take us deeper into factors that will move our organization in the direction that we want to continue moving. And then the last thing that I will add is after doing this year's survey, Polco reached out to us and they wanted to do a case study based on our high level of participation and our overall survey ratings. So they have they've gone ahead and published the case study, great information within the case study. And we were also able to present some of this data at the ELG conference this past week. So that concludes my presentation. I'll answer any questions you may have.
On that last slide that you put up, it's been published.
It has.
Have we done anything with it on our social media or our?
We'll be working with communications on a couple of things, so probably should have mentioned this in the next steps. We're going to be working with communications to highlight all this information in our recruitment and also to get this out. As Tammy mentioned, how do we create the splash with this? So we'll be working to get this out and really market it in a way that lets everybody know what a great employer we are.
Well, the point I want to make is, if that's been published with a case study, there's value in our communications, putting that out there as a, I guess, action of what's been going on here at the city. I mean, that's good PR right there. Okay, so just want to follow up to make sure that that is one of your follow-up pieces. With that, Bill, did you want? You good? Go, Patrick?
Just kudos and congratulations to all the supervisors and all the directors here in the room that have implemented all of that to get those high remarks. That's incredible. And the engagement from our employees. I think everybody that runs the day-to-day operations should be very proud of what they've accomplished. That's pretty neat to see and excited to be a part of. So congratulations to all of you.
Laura? I'm going to work right this way.
Well, I was thinking that the last study was done, in the height of COVID, and now it's been 2 years. And we've seen, I think, nationally and locally, significant changes in the workplace. But to come through with such high marks and high commitment to the employee, from the employees to the organization, is really a spectacular accomplishment. And like Patrick said, congratulations to city management and department heads for setting that environment. The investment that you've made in the culture and values, and even rolling out the performance management system, has just really paid off. So very well done.
Brandon?
Yeah, same thing. So congratulations on everything. I mean, better? Did it go now?
You're on.
Yeah, congratulations. We want to be the premier employer in the West, well, in the state, really. So I take a lot of pride in, I think we hire some of the best staff here. So it's great to see that we are continuing a good culture, and that we can still be a premier place for people to want to come work. And to Mayor's point as well, we want to make sure we advertise that, and I think we can, even as we're growing and growing and growing, that we can continue to attract the best and brightest in local government. So thank you.
Sherry?
Can't get this on. Thank you very much, and I think it's really good, like Laura said, about, having those results post-COVID. This is the first one post-COVID, and lots has changed. Obviously, we have a new home and everything, so I think there's a lot of positives going forward. So I appreciate everybody's hard work, to get those results, because I think it takes a team. I know we got some executive summaries and portions, but is the whole book available to go through? I'm kind of like, I like to look at the questions, because for me, I sometimes like to, I didn't get, maybe it's up in my office.
Might be up there.
It's probably up in my office then. Okay.
Yes.
So I didn't get up there today yet, but thank you, yes.
Bill?
These results are really, they're very positive, and I think that continuous improvement piece that we keep talking about probably drives a lot of the questions that I have more about process or procedure than the results themselves, because the results are pretty spectacular. So the employee count, or the number of people that took the survey, how does that influence the outcome data? So I realize 50% of 400 people and 50% of 700 people is still 50%, but how does that, some of these results moved 1% or stayed the same, or, so talk about the methodology, if you can, for just a minute, about how does that influence that?
Sure. And more than anything else, it just drives a higher confidence level. It's an average score. So the more, the higher the participation rate, the greater confidence in it. It is the average score, so those are employee voices that are registering high marks in the areas that they're registering high marks in. I think one of the distinguishing points is when we look at that council goal, and you can see the number of employees that are migrating to that highest score. When we start dissecting it at that level, we're able to really drive organizational change. That's one of the reasons we're looking at bringing in Q12, because it's going to take us down to another level of data set where we're looking at it at a supervisor level. So we think we can drive even better scores and better engagement by doing that.
And I think you'll get better data from that as well, bless you. Thanks for that. We had, there were a number of questions. You said it went from 135 to 99. I would be curious if it's possible to get as a follow-up, what questions were no longer asked? So we can just kind of, and then what were the 2020 survey results of those? Just so we know what, were they the, let's just, for the sake of simple numbers, were they the 35 questions that we scored the worst in? Were they the 35 questions we scored the best in? Where are we at in that regard? And then there were 24 new questions in this survey. So not only did we go from 135 down to 99, but we also introduced 24 first-time questions. So, that there's good data, and you mentioned that we were talking about the diversity, inclusion, that's really good. We need to know where we stand on that. And what I'm afraid, the news is so good. This is the, and I'm going to use football analogy because Doug was up earlier. He's still back
Yeah,
there.
Doug's back there.
But this is celebrating on the 5-yard line before you get across the field goal, or across the goal line. So I want to celebrate, but I want to make sure we're not too premature with some of that. I did note that we had 5 areas that decreased in score from the last time to this time. One of the slides we talked about had only one. I didn't know if that was a section or.
And it is statistically significant. So they're looking at, in order for it to drop, it's got to be 5 points or either
5.
higher or lower.
I was using 4.
Yeah.
So, okay. And then, we had a huge number, 28% improvement in a number of areas, which I thought was, which is really good for us. And, all we do is say, yay to raises, yay to benefits, and you guys take care of the rest. So it's kind of nice to know that this whole team effort is really starting to pay off. But I think for us as council, we instituted a number of goals either in the city manager's performance evaluation process or within the strategic plan, and we should continue to kind of press the staff to push on some of these. So the deeper dive that you're getting from that. And I've got 2 kind of gee whiz questions that go with this. One is we had such a huge increase in the question about career path. And I have to wonder, is that real or is that perceived? Because we've added a lot of new titles. We used to just I'm looking at Christopher. So everybody was a planner. Well, now we got a planner 1 and a planner 2 and a planner 3 and a senior planner and a blah, blah. Is that the career path that we've created, or just through titles, or is it a genuine, I can move on from here? Because some of the department survey results were not very strong in I have a future.
Mm-hmm.
So I wondered if that was, and this is more rhetorical, but I wondered if that was what the result of that was. So I guess you guys take that back and digest it. I don't want an answer. And then finally, the turnover rate. Mm-hmm. We have these great survey results, but where is our turnover rate? Because that's really the true benchmark of what we're doing. If we can have these great survey results, but we still have a 15% turnover rate, which I know it's not, obviously the survey is irrelevant because you've got people that are leaving the organization constantly. So, and I know we've got a quarterly update from the manager's office on those turnover rates, but I don't remember the last one. Where are we on that? I think we're less than 10%.
Yeah, we're right about 12.7%.
We are.
So, yeah, and it's, what I'll say is it's up slightly, but we're faring better than most.
Yeah.
But it is up slightly, so I think the employment conditions are very interesting, more so than I've ever seen in my 20-plus years in HR. I've never seen anything like this. But I completely agree with you. I think all this effort has got to impact our turnover, or we're not really gaining what we want to gain out of it.
Right, and I think that turnover by department is obviously indicative. We saw, you know, if you look at the department response by department, which is the last part of the report that we got, you know, it's very telling about what's happening within the organization itself. So globally, we've got this great news, and I certainly want to celebrate that. But at the same respect, when that happens, you know, the old expression, one shoot wipes out 100 attaboys, and so I'm always looking forward to preventing the shoot from happening. So, but just great results, and I think you can see it in employees when you run into them, and you know they are genuinely happier. And it's been interesting to watch in my now over 20 years in the city to see the fresh perspective, and you know, change happens one retirement at a time. So I think we're 20 years through that. So kudos to everybody.
Yeah, the only thing I want to add is I was kind of curious because I know today in this environment, it's a little harder to recruit. For whatever reason, people probably got used to sitting at home. So I guess my question is are you seeing people kind of opting out when they can find a job where they can work from their house, or they can work maybe 2 days at home versus 5 days in the office? Are you seeing any of that potential turnover in your stats?
We've seen some. Not heavy, but where we see it is on the recruitment front. So we do have a number of people who are looking for more telework opportunities.
Okay.
So we see that more than we've ever seen in the past.
Okay.
But I wouldn't say that we're experiencing turnover related to that.
Okay, thank you. Does the council have any comments or accommodations or reports on current events? Anybody's got anything? City manager have anything?
I do not, Mayor.
Oh, then the next meeting will be work session on October 24th, 2022, beginning at 5 PM, followed by a regular meeting. With that being said, this meeting's over.